We're going to talk about things that are very, very personal to me. More and more, I find myself angling, inching into more personal things, my family, myself, especially how I see how history has left its mark on us today, and we shouldn't forget it. We should use it as lessons for ourselves and for our children and our grandchildren, those of us who are blessed to have grandchildren. I don't have any yet. But welcome to Monday School. And if you have friends and family anywhere in the world, ask them to tune in for education on mental and spiritual health. Today, I am going to make Monday School a lesson from my mother, a powerful lesson from my mother. And I'm sure you all have lessons from your mother as well, and your father, and other loved ones that you play in your minds or in your heads like videotapes every day, probably every minute of the day. So tell your friends and family to tune in to today's edition of Monday School. Anywhere they are in the world, they can go to our website at NuSpecies.com. They can go to our app, and Mary is trying to get us on other platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. So tell them to tune in anywhere they are in the world. Today we're going to take a comprehensive look at how we're going to help our mental and spiritual health. You all know NuSpecies. NuSpecies formulas and products are designed for our physical health, but NuSpecies history, the history education we give, are designed for mental and spiritual health. And of course, it's about human history, and then particularly it's about African history and people who are of African history or heritage, for us to still try to work through and understand what happened and how we package it for our lives today, for our children, because it was devastating and it is still devastating on all of us, on everybody, black and white, because others who are not of African history have to carry some of the burden or some of the pain or some of the discomforts. So it affects everyone in more ways than we all can imagine. So here we go. A lesson from my mother. And this is a tough one, people. This lesson is about how my mother used forgiveness and redemption, probably the most powerful principle in the Holy Bible and the most powerful principle in the sacred texts of the Africans, the Book of the Dead, the pyramid text, the coffin text, and all the papyri, hundreds of papyri, religious sacred texts. How she used forgiveness and redemption to live and survive for herself and probably for all of us, her children. How she protected us. how she protected herself, and how we all must do the same to move forward and strive for a better world for our children and grandchildren. So this forgiveness and redemption is probably not what you're thinking. And I observed this in my mother since I was 4 years old. 4 years old, there's a church that's on the hill where I was born. It's a Moravian church made of stone. And from I was 3, 4 years old, I was going to church since I was a baby, but I started having memories, and I still have those memories from when I was 3, 4 years old. I used to go with her to church, and I used to sit on her right side. I still don't know why she had me sit on her right side, but I always sat on her right side. And she would keep her black pocketbook on the floor between she and myself. And then the other kids were around us, those who were in church. And by the way, my mother had 13 children, but she raised at least 6 more that she adopted. So there was a lot of kids. Oh my gosh! Now that I think about it, it's making me feel, very emotional. But I would sit by her when I was 3, 4 years old. But I wasn't going to church for God or Jesus. I was going because her pocketbook was filled with mint balls. We used to call them sweetie. And my eyes were always just looking down on that pocketbook, wondering when she was going to reach down and give me, a mint ball. I was 3, 4 years old, right? Maybe a little older. But my mother would go to church every Sunday. Every Sunday at 9 o'clock, because there are 2 hours of Sunday school before the actual adult church. So that was my mother. So she went to church every Sunday, rain, storm, hurricane, shine, heat, nothing stops her, which means nothing stops us from going to church every Sunday. So that's how I grew up, people. So when I tell you that I have spirituality in me, it's not because I want it there, it's because it was put there by my mother. But that's not the lesson from my mother. The lesson from my mother is how she dealt with the challenges in life, the brutal challenges in life, and she never talked about them. My mother never talked about race, never once. She never talked about history. I have never heard her use a foul word in my whole life. I swear to you on that. Never heard her use even the word shit. That was my mother. And she's still the most genuinely religious, spiritual human I have ever met. I have never heard her criticize anyone except her children. I've never heard her spoke ill of anyone. Never. Never, never. So I am going to get into why I think she lived by the principle, the biblical principle, and the Cushite Kemite principle of forgiveness and redemption. But before we get to that, we need to talk about how we lost everything. We lost everything. African people lost everything. Everything. So we're going to do a little recap on how it began, so you can understand my mother's spirituality and what she taught me, what she taught us, her children, and others, because she was also a teacher and an officer in the church that we went to. So a little recap, and my mother never talked about this, about Genesis 9 with Noah, mandating that Ham's son should be slave and servants of Shem and Japheth. My mother never talked about that. And she never talked about what happened after that, even though she knew these biblical stories, because she knew the Bible better than anyone except my father. My father, you just start to say any verse in the Bible, just start to say it or read it, and he'll finish it for you. That's how my father was with the Bible. But my mother, she knew the story of Noah declaring that Ham, who is black, he's African, he's the man from whom the Bible says the African tribes or the African race came from. So the Bible says in Genesis 9. So Ham, his son, that he named Canaan. So a lot of you don't know that Canaan was a piece of land that was part of Africa. Canaan was part of Africa. The land of Canaan was part of Africa. That is where Palestine now is, and Jordan and Israel. That piece of land was part of Africa. And the Canaanites there were the people of Ham. And those are the ones that Noah said in Genesis 9 should become slaves and servants of Shem and Japheth, who were white. But then it went beyond that. In Deuteronomy 20, in Joshua 6, and in other areas in the Bible like 1 Samuel, the mandate was there for all these people of the Canaanites to be slaughtered, genocide of women and children. So these were African people. These were not Jews, these were not Arabs. These were Canaanites of Ham. So you have to understand that perspective, that they were slaughtered, and some scholars believe, I believe as well, because Noah dehumanized them to be slaves and servants. They were dehumanized. And people, you know this from your own lives, personal lives. If you want to make someone irrelevant, if you want to make someone to be nothing, you dehumanize them. You call them a criminal. You call them dishonest. You call them a liar. You call them all these derogative names, and they're dehumanized. And now you can step on them. Now you can destroy them. Now you feel it's justified to destroy them. Now you feel that God doesn't love them because you don't love them. That's what happened here. So the Canaanites were slaughtered. It's in the Bible. Again, look at the verses in the Bible. Joshua, Samuel, Deuteronomy. It's all there. Go back and read it. These were African people who were being slaughtered. So after they were slaughtered, others moved in and took over the land. And that took place probably after 1200 BC. That was immediately before the time of Moses. Moses existed about between 1400 and 1200 BC. That's before Christ. That was the time of Moses. So Moses was given the mandate to slaughter the Canaanites, and Moses said, hell, I'm not doing it. And others went in and did it. So those were the Canaanites. So, and those were the first Israelites. Those were the original. The Canaanites were the original Israelites, because the land got renamed to Israel, but now it's not is no longer African. So the whole piece of land, Canaan, was taken over, and it was governed for up until around 1100 BC by the Kemites, the ancient Egyptians who were the Kemites. It was that piece of land was governed by them, and then eventually they gave it up as well because it was taken over by other people. So that is the beginning of Africans losing everything. That was the beginning. That was about 600 years before Kemet was destroyed, and it was about 700 years before Cush was destroyed. And we're going to get to that. But that's Canaan. That's the land of Canaan. That's the land of the Canaanites. That's the land of Ham's son and his tribes over several hundred years. They were Africans. And that's where the destruction of African people began. And it's there in the Bible. You just have to know what you're reading in the Bible. So now we can move down to Kemet. So Kemet was the next piece of Africa that was destroyed. And Nahum, the books of Nahum, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, what you all should do is just sit down and read these books, especially those areas in these books by these prophets. Just read what happened to the Cushites and the Kemites. Of course, you know that Egypt is a new name. It's a recent name. Egypt is Africa. They got renamed for whatever reason, just as how Cush got renamed to Ethiopia and or Nubia at some point in time. So you have to think about what happened then, and the new names that they have may distract you from the real truth of what happened there. So the Kemites, Nahum, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, and Ezekiel document all what happened to the Kemites and the Cushites. I don't have to go over those. You've heard me gone over it. But this is, again, where African culture was coalesced. It was coalesced here. And the people came from all over Africa, because what the history books won't tell you is that Southern Africa is where humans had gathered after they were in Northern Africa for quite some time. They were in Ethiopia, the first humans, as you already know, and in Kenya, going back 3 to 8 million years. But the weather changes over Africa because of the Milky Way galaxy, because of the Orion constellation, because of the Sirius star, because of our sun. Those three areas of the constellation, when they collide, not collide as in clash, but when they override one another and they combine the heat, that's what caused a lot of the global warming around the world, but especially in Africa. So the Africans are always running from one place to another to escape, the heat, because the land would just dry up and become desert. So they had run from Southern Africa to Northern Africa, when the Sahara about 7,000 years ago was a rainforest that became a savanna, right? And now it's a desert. But people still live in the Sahara. Just as how the Nubian desert, there are people who still live in there. And even Kemet and Nubia had deserts, still have deserts to this day. And then down in Southern Africa is the Kalahari. Down there, that's a huge desert down there where the Khoikhoi tribes are. So Africans are always moving around because of the changes of the weather, and that's how they coalesced. Africans coalesced in Northern Africa along the Niles. There are 3 Niles. Some of you may not know that there are 3 Niles. There was a yellow Nile from Chad that fed the main Nile. So there was a yellow Nile, but it got dried up because, again, the climate change. And now we only have the blue Nile and the white Nile, one from Tanzania, fed by the Lake Nalibale, which is Lake Victoria. It got renamed by the British. And then Lake Tano, that feeds the other Nile, and they all come together at Khartoum, and then they flow north into the Mediterranean Sea. So the people were moving to fresh water, and that's why the talents and the resources, the inventions of the Africans, that's why it coalesced, it came together around Kush and Kemet. All that knowledge came together. We're not going to go into all the pieces of it, but go back and do your research. You'll see that mathematics came from Congo. You'll see that smelting came from Mali and Chad, in metallurgy, and that existed at least 2,000-3,000 years before ancient Egypt, or before Kemet, before Kush. So all this knowledge, especially when it came to astrophysics, in terms of astronomy at Adam's Calendar in Southern Africa, and then you had the same thing, astrophysics at Naphtha in Nubia, right? So you have all this coalesced in Kush and Kemet. So Southern Africa's astrophysics was about 70,000 years before Christ, which meant it was about 65 years before Kemet, about 65 years before Kush. And then Naphtha was about 10,000 years before Kemet, same thing, about 10,000 years before Kush. So you got to have all these historical contexts to understand what really happened. So we talk about Kush and Kemet. Go read Nahum. If you don't want, it's not in the history books. It's not in the colleges, all this information. So you have to go back to the Bible. The Bible has a lot of it, or unless you want to go read a lot of the papyrus or papyri that are out there that are written by our ancestors. But all this information is not readily available. But thanks to the Jews who wrote the Bible, they wrote it in the Bible. It's in the Bible. So you can't just pick parts of the Bible that you want to believe and others that you don't want to believe. And then after speaking about we losing everything, the massive human devastation of slavery, a lot of you don't understand what really happened. Well, we're not going to get into this in this episode, but between 12 and 20 million slaves or people, about between 12 and 20 million were taken out of Africa. People, that is a massive human brain drain, resource, brain drain from a continent, from a country. Because you all know that the most precious resource of any country are its people, its citizens, right? Between 20 up to 20 million, 12 and 20 million people were taken out of Africa to other parts of the world. And this is separate from colonialism. So if Africa was going to progress, it couldn't with this massive loss of people, resources, the brain drain, just the resource drain from humans in a country or a continent. It's massive, people. So the way Africa is today, it's lucky it's gotten this far, because right after this came colonialism, and you all know what happened during colonialism. A lot of the people in Africa became slaves in Africa. And then, of course, trillions of dollars in the natural resources were taken out to other parts of the world. Trillions of dollars. So the human resource, the natural resource from minerals taken out of that one place. Now people tell me, how in God's world where these people were going to succeed. How in God's world these people were going to compete with the rest of the world. How? There's nowhere on earth where this ever happened. Nowhere on earth. So, yes, there are those who expect people to be more progressive in life, to do better in life, but African people are poor because of this. And we haven't even gotten to how the Africans stop worshiping. When I say Africans, I mean where they are in the world, wherever they are in the world, they stop worshiping their original supreme God, and they stop practicing their original sacred divine spirituality. So when you put all that together, we have lost everything. What else is there? So a lot of you have brought this to me and asked me what my thoughts were. So the talents, the inventions, the creation of the Africans coalesced in Kush and in Kemet. That's where they all came together, all that knowledge. It was global climate change, or it was climate change, the torrid heat from the weather changes that forced them to move north. And that's why Naphtha, one of the most significant places in the world in terms of ancient inventions, studying the stars. That's why they abandoned that site, because it had gotten so hot they couldn't live there anymore. That's why they abandoned Adam's calendar, as they have abandoned many places in Mali and Chad and all over the African continent because of the weather changes. So the weather changes are what push African to Northern Africa, East Africa, West Africa, because they had to get close to the Great Lakes. That's where the Great Lakes are. All right? So there are poor people everywhere. So yes, there are more poor people in Africa probably than elsewhere because of what I just said. They lost their resources. They lost their human resources. And then they lost all their, not all, but they lost massive amount of their mineral resources. It just got transported to other places in the world. So this is not in the history books. And the colleges and the universities don't talk about it. And it's not in the media. So if you're poor and you don't have the resources to protect yourselves, you don't have the resources to have an army or a proper army or proper whatever weapons to protect yourselves, you will be dominated. And it's just a human factor. So let's break it down. When you all dominate your children at home, you dominate your wife at home, you dominate your neighbors, you dominate your friends, you dominate people in general. Your domination of people, it doesn't mean that you're smarter. It means you're more ruthless and cruel when you dominate people or children. And if you're ruthless and you have money to pay for weapons of mass destruction, to pay for a large army. And if you don't care about committing mass murder and genocides, you will always win by your sheer ruthless domination of those you don't care about. And especially of those who don't have the resources or the mindset or the soul to commit like atrocities. You will dominate them. All right? So my mother, I think she knew this, and that's why she never criticized people. And what I've come to realize since I got older, I used to think of her as this powerful woman. And at some point, I would even wonder what she was feeling. I literally did as an adult, especially when my father got sick and he was dying. My mother was just the tower of strength. You know, it would seem to me that she was unfazed by his suffering, because I remember very clearly how my father used to ask God to take his life, why God was making him to suffer. And he used to ask God, why are you making me to suffer like this? What did I do? Okay, he suffered when the prostate cancer spread to his bone. I think, up to the point of his death, he weighed maybe 60 or 70 pounds. He was just all bones. And he just couldn't move. And he would just pray for God to take his life. But my mother, she just went about life, went about everything. And I never saw her cried once. I'm not saying she didn't. I never saw her cried once. And before I tell you about my mother's spirituality, I'm going to tell you about her. So my mother, after my father died, my mother had diabetes, and it wasn't that bad at first, but eventually she had to do 4 or 5 amputation, probably more, because the doctors would try to save her legs when she started getting gangrene in her toes. So they would cut a toe here, they cut a toe there from the other foot. My mother loved cute shoes. I tell you, she'd go to church every Sunday, and there's nothing she loved like her cute shoes. And they would just squeeze her toes, and they would become sore and never get better. And eventually they got gangrene, and so they would amputate her toes one by one until they amputate one leg, and then they amputate another leg. And then they had to go back and re-amputate the same leg they had amputated a few years before. And I've never heard her cried or complained. I never heard that woman cried or complained. Just as how she didn't cry about my father. Even when my father died, I didn't see her cry. Never saw her cry. And then she went through all the amputation in the hospital in Black River, St. Elizabeth. She never cried. And then one day I talked to her. I talked to her about God. We used to have a white Jesus in the Springfield church right behind the pulpit. There was this I'm telling you all a lot about me today. There was this portrait of Jesus, this man with long hair, long blonde hair, blue eyes, pale skin, right behind the pulpit, so you can't miss him. You couldn't miss him, Jesus. And I remember when I was a child, I probably was around 8 or 9 years old then. And I'm going to take a break, Mary. Look like I'm getting ahead of myself. But I got to tell you before we take the break, I got to tell you about me and that Jesus. I didn't see Jesus then as white. I didn't even know he was white at that age. He was just Jesus. I didn't think in terms of black and white. I never did, because those things were never talked about in our home. Never talked about. By my father, by my mother, by my brothers and sisters who are older. Black and white never came up. Never came up as far as I can recall. So the white Jesus now, I used to stare at this portrait and I would feel that he was staring right back at me. But later I realized that it doesn't matter where I went in the church, he was staring at me. So whether you're on the right side, it was a huge church. It wasn't a small church. It was probably about 60, 70 feet in diameter. That's how wide it was. It was a huge, huge church. And then from the back to the front was about probably the same, probably a little, maybe 80 feet. And then we were closer to the front of the church. My mother was always like in the third or so row. So I would stare at this man, Jesus, in the portrait. And one day I asked my mother, Mom, why is my head swelling when I look at him? And my mother said, it's a good thing. It's because you have the Spirit of God in you. That's what she would say to me. But I remember every Sunday I sat there and I would stare at that man, and sometimes I would fall asleep, because I used to sleep when I was a kid. I just fall asleep because the preacher would go on the pulpit and it would preach for 1.5 hours nonstop. And you're not supposed to get up and pee or do anything during the time. So that's what my mother said to me. It's the Spirit of God moving through you. That's why your head's swollen. It's a good thing. So when we come back, we're going to wrap up and talk about the lesson from my mother. Because the lesson from my mother, now that I have gotten so much into our history and our ancestors, I'm beginning to realize that my mother was teaching me things, teaching us things, and she wasn't using words to do it. She was using her own way of conducting herself, her own actions were the lessons. And the more I talked to my brothers and sisters about it, I realized that was her way of teaching us how to live and survive in this world, and how to teach our children and grandchildren to survive in this world. So when we come back, I'm going to tell you how this woman lived. And I think a lot of you out there today, black and white, but especially black folks, I think that's the way you live today without knowing it. So when we come back, we're going to talk about the real lesson from my mother. I have helped so many of you over the last 15, 20 years. I've helped you with high blood pressure, with diabetes, with cancer, autoimmune diseases, sickle cell diseases, I have helped tens of thousands of you worldwide, and you don't even know who I am. You don't even know my name, but I'm going to tell you my name. I am Aston Farquharson. I am the founder of NuSpecies Corporation. I am the CEO and President of NuSpecies Corporation. And I want to thank you all for allowing me and my team at NuSpecies to help you. And I hope over the next weeks and months and years to come, we will be able to help many more of you. But in the meantime, I want to talk to you about human history. Human history based on science, based on DNA science, based on paleoanthropology, and all the discoveries that have been made, and human history, human evolution. So I'd like to share some of the knowledge I have about human history. The what, when, where of human history, and in the end, how I believe human history play a role in our health, in our diets, and how its knowledge can help us to live longer and better. I will begin with one piece of land located between the Mediterranean Sea and Tanzania, and one lake that we all should consider a lake that is like the Mother of God, the mother of mankind. And this lake is called Lake Nalubale. It was renamed Lake Victoria by the British about 100 years ago. So let's talk about this one strip of land. It is not separated by oceans. It is not separated by seas. It's not separated by water, stretching from Egypt to Tanzania. So this one piece of land has an area called Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, right by the Rift Valley, not far from Kenya. Olduvai Gorge is where scientists and paleoanthropologists believe the first humans on Earth appear. 1.9 million years ago, the Homo habilis appeared there. Thereafter came Homo erectus about 1.2 million years ago. But even before habilis and erectus, Lucy existed about 3.2 million years ago. So why is this piece of land so important? From Tanzania to Kenya to Ethiopia to Somalia to Eritrea to Sudan to Nubia to ancient Egypt. All these countries had tribal kingdoms existing there for probably 10,000 years. And these people very likely emerge from Homo erectus. Homo sapiens emerged around 1 million years to 500,000 years ago. So these tribal kingdoms and this one piece of land may be the people who created the first kingdoms on earth, the first villages on earth, the first civilizations on earth, the first empires on earth. And that's why we're going to talk about them. Lake Nalubale, or Lake Victoria, is located right by Tanzania and is abutted by several other countries. But what's important about Lake Nalubale is that Olduvai Gorge is right around the corner from Lake Nalubale. What does it mean? Water. Lake Nalubale feeds today, as in ancient times, many rivers flowing south into Africa. But even more importantly, Lake Nalubale feeds the Nile River, the entire Nile Valley, the White Nile, the Blue Nile. It feeds all the countries I have just mentioned, and it runs from Tanzania into the Mediterranean Ocean. That is how important the Nile River is to the Nile dwellers who have lived there for over 10,000 years. In some cases, there are artifacts showing that they may have lived along the Nile for at least 30,000 years. From all indications, Homo habilis and Homo erectus, as well as the early Homo sapiens, seem to have fed about 80 to 90% on sedges and other fruits and vegetables. That's what they ate, all the way up through to modern times. In the Nile Valley, where farming began on the Sahara, farming began there probably about 10,000 years ago. And these Nile dwellers and Saharans were eating millet, sorghum, chickpeas, and other tubers that they could grow. And again, they ate some fish and some meat, but it doesn't seem that they were eating more than perhaps 10% meat. Again, it was between 80 and 90% fruit and vegetables, and then we could add now tubers like yams and potatoes. So you could say that these tribal kingdoms didn't do so bad in building their civilizations because these people were able to build edifices like stela, pyramids, temples. They were able to build extraordinary irrigation systems and dams. They dug many wells, deep wells, for water during the drying up of the landscape. And all the other extraordinary culture in artifacts, arts, architecture, science, astronomy, engineering that these people engage in at an extremely high level before 3000 BC, possibly before even 4000 BC, 4,000 years before Christ. That is how extraordinary these people were. And the Nazlet, the Atarians, are the next group of people and cultures like those who created the first commercial and industrialized systems that are known to man, that engage in trade practices, and they build administrative system and other institutions. You could say all the tribal kingdoms from these countries, they form the early beginning of human culture, and they forge some of the greatest knowledge and inventions in human history. So we're going to talk about these people because these tribal kingdoms are the group of people who formed what are now known today as the Kushites and the Egyptians. That's written about so extraordinarily in the Bible and other historical texts. That's been written about by some of the most respected scholars and ancient historians who ever lived. So we're going to talk about all that, and I'm going to share all this information with you, and hopefully at the end of this discussion you'll be able to understand better about human history and human evolution and how you may need to live today to be able to live better and longer. All right, welcome back. Welcome back to lesson from my mother and Monday school. We're going to wrap it up. We only have a few minutes, so and that's all I need, I think, to wrap it up. So, just to recap, a little bit, the genocides of Canaan and Kemet and Cush and slavery and colonialism made us reject. That's the cause. Everything I just said, we reject our original supreme God and sacred spirituality. Yes, we have. You should all admit to it. We accept other religions without really converting and adapting to them, which is weird. Really, really weird. We accept parts of the Bible, but we reject other parts. We adapt the Jewish biblical culture, but we don't get converted to Judaism. So at some level, we're just hypocrites. Either we accept something fully or we don't. We accept, the Arabic culture and religion, but we don't convert to Islam. We don't. So why bother go halfway or part of the way? And then there are others among us who adopt parts of Hinduism, but we don't really adopt the universal God and humanity and divinity of Hinduism. So in ways we're living our own brand of religion, which to me doesn't make any sense, but it just tells me that we just have a lot more to do. We have a lot more knowledge and information to gather to guide us in the right path. But the way my mother did it, was different, and maybe a lot of you, that's what you do today. So I mentioned that my father, he died. He suffered for a couple of years before he died, and I never saw my mother cry. She prayed a lot for him, She prayed endlessly for him, but she didn't cry. And before she got sick herself, she buried all her friends. She buried all her friends. All her friends died. All her church sisters and brothers died, and she buried them because my mother was a burial minister as well. I guess she was a lot of things. So she buried all her friends, and she gladly buried all her friends. And then she got sick, and I mentioned the amputations that she went through. They were devastating, at least to me, but she never cried. So I did talk to her about her spirituality once or twice. And what I discovered from my mother was shocking, absolutely shocking. It's still shocking to me to this day. But then it made sense why my eldest brother died. She cried. When my eldest brother, Emery, died, I saw my mother wept. And she wept because she said he should be burying her, not her burying him. But she wept. But when I talked to my mother about spirituality, what I discovered from my mother is that my mother did not live for this world. My mother didn't care much about this world. My mother said there was so much evil in this world. This world is not of God. This world is not of the true and living God she believed in. So my mother did not live for this world. My mother did not care about this world. I guess if the doctors had cut off her hands and other body parts, she probably wouldn't have cared. Because she didn't live for this world. She didn't care about this world because this world was so filled with evil people. So she prayed and worshiped God dutifully, powerfully, profoundly, going to church every Sunday, becoming a burial minister, a church officer, because she was living for the next world. She didn't care about this world. She didn't care for the things of this world. That's what she told me. That's what she taught me. And she didn't study history the way I have, but she must have known enough to realize how evil the world is, truly evil. So my mother had moved on. She was the true Cushite. She was the true Chemite. She was the true African Cushite Chemite, where my mother forgives everything in this world that's bad. And that's why she never criticized and she never complained. She forgives everything, and she look for the next life for redemption from this life. Like our ancestors, the Cushite Chemites, the way they wrote it in the sacred texts, the way they nominated or deified Horus to be the god of forgiveness and redemption. That's what my mother believed in, not this world, the afterlife, the next world. That's what she lived for. That's what she looked forward to. The way our ancestors made Usur the god of judgment and the resurrection. The God of judgment and the resurrection. He was deified God of judgment and the resurrection. That's what my mother believed in. I don't think my mother ever heard about Usser. I don't think she ever heard about Heru. I doubt it. But she knew about Jesus. She loved Jesus. She loves God. So that's what my mother believed in. She believes in forgiveness and redemption. And I think a lot of people today, especially a lot of African people, that's how they view this world. And that's why they don't care about what happens in this world. As far as they're concerned, the next life, the afterlife, the spiritual world, the world of God is the real world. And that's the world they live for. That's what I believe. And I don't see anything that could sway me to believe otherwise. And those were the words of my mother. She lives for the next life. Forgiveness and redemption. You all think about that. And have a great week.